Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to the kickoff lecture in our IRP Thursday seminar. Very excited to get it started for fall of 2023. We have a great lineup of speakers, so please look at the calendar. You can download or click on or somehow acquire the iCal, so it just populates your calendar. And I would encourage you to do that. We have some really spectacular speakers, including today's speaker. Before I tell you about her, I want to also note at IRP we're doing something a little new or different, or we just haven't done before. For students, faculty, staff that are interested, we're having a Justice, Equity, and Diversity Inclusion group discussion of the seminar. The half hour following the talk, this is going to be held down in 2435, which is what room, Becca? Is that our conference room? No, it's not ours. It's not ours. It's a floor below. So 2435. I will write that on the board, or yeah, I can write that on the board. So if you are not running off to do something else and want to stop in for part of that conversation, we'd love to have you, or as many of you that can join us. We are kicking off our seminar series with Leah Hamilton. She's at Appalachian State, is that correct?
Yep.
She's in the School of Social Work there, and she's going to be talking about her work on guaranteed income and how that is advancing racial and economic justice. I'm delighted to turn it over to her. She welcomes your interruptions, so please feel free, at least raise your hand, don't just scream out. And let her call on you. So Leah, we're excited to hear from you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody.
Right on the board, so I'll
okay.
behind you for a second.
Okay, no problem. Yep, so I'm Leah Hamilton. Please do interrupt me anytime you have questions. My background is in social work. I teach in the School of Social Work. I spent a lot of years as a foster care caseworker, came to do a PhD in public policy. Can you hear me okay? Am I projecting enough? Okay, they were trying to mic me up with two mics, and I said, I'm going to try to project. So I am the principal investigator for 4 guaranteed income pilots / basic income pilots across the country. We can talk about the definitions of those if you're interested in Q&A. Co-investigator for a 5th. I'm going to talk today about one specifically focused on 600 Black women in Georgia. That's really an exciting pilot. You're welcome to ask me anything about any of the other pilots if you're interested. The first thing I want to say is if a white woman of privilege is standing in a university classroom in Wisconsin talking about racial and economic justice, it's a good chance 1,000 other people with less privilege have said all of these things before. I'm not going to say anything new or novel today. I just, my time here on earth, I'd like to use whatever platform I have to advance really important movements for racial and economic justice happening across the country and hopefully not screw it up too bad. So first I want to talk about kind of what brought me to this work. I started out as a foster care caseworker. I had a client, I did a lot of case management for teens in foster care with developmental disabilities, and I had one client, I'll call him Thomas. He had severe cerebral palsy. He was in a wheelchair. He used a feeding tube where you can't swallow, your food goes directly through your stomach. He was nonverbal. Basically, he needed round-the-clock physical care for his needs. He had a mom, I'll call her Sue, who was a dedicated single mom to 5 kids. But because Thomas's needs were so great, his physical needs were so great, it's really difficult to hold down a job if any of you have worked with kids or family members with disabilities. Even if they can go to school, they get sick, they need backup care. So she basically had 2 choices. She could raise her 5 kids on maybe $800 a month in the disability payments she got for Thomas, maybe if she's lucky, a few hundred more in food stamps and housing assistance, or she could surrender Thomas to foster care. That's inevitably what she did. And then I became the case manager for the family, the case foster family who was taking care of him. And because his needs were so great, that foster family got a much higher monthly reimbursement rate than most foster parents get. They got $3,000 a month to care for this child. So that was really one of my first clues among many as a foster care caseworker that there was something deeply wrong with the American social safety net. This family was divided, not even because it saved taxpayer money, but because we have a social safety net constructed with a suspicious eye towards people in poverty. I'll fast forward through, 15-ish years doing poverty policy research, and just say that, you know, my orientation now is that our social safety net is built on the pillars of racism, sexism, classism. That's how it was built and how it continues to operate today. I also have spent the last 10 years or so in sort of like the financial capability asset building world. I was telling somebody I was a doc student during like the individual development account era, and I've observed sort of the financial well-being academic space ask a lot of questions like, how do we get the poor to save? How do we get the poor to use their money better? And I have come to this very, you know, highly academic, highly theoretical question of, what if we just stopped oppressing people and extracting wealth from them, then see what happens? So this is sort of what brought me to the guaranteed income world. The first thing I'm going to do is give a very, very brief background to give some context about why I think the social safety net is racist, sexist, classist, all of those things. I know because of y'all are IRP affiliates, you probably, 99% of you know 99% of this, but I'm going to go through it quickly, and hopefully in case there's any students that don't know all of this or anybody watching the recordings, but feel free to tell me, like, wrap it up, Leah. Okay, so we all know that the safety net expanded rapidly in the 1930s with things like AFDC pulling millions of people out of the Great Depression, and by that I mean white people. There was sexist and racist norms that kept a lot of people, a lot of women of color especially, off the rolls. For example, some welfare offices had separate sample budgets, one for white families and one for black families, with the assumption that black families could make do with less. In some rural areas, welfare offices would just shut down during the harvest season to make sure there's a steady stream of cheap labor. If you're interested in that history, Frances Fox Piven and Mimi Abromowitz have done a great job of documenting that, but also intersectionality theorists like Kimberly Crenshaw have done a really great job of talking about how these are simply just a replication of the slavery era attempts to control the lives and reproduction of black people, but black women especially. And then in the 1960s, of course, welfare rights organizers like the amazing Johnny Tillman really worked hard to defeat some of these racist and sexist barriers that kept a lot of people off the welfare rolls, inspired the Great Society movements, and things like Medicaid, Medicare, Head Start, food stamps, really all came out of this work, and the EITC. Of course, very quickly, growing white backlash to that movement, to the civil rights movement, created fertile ground for politicians who were seeking to undercut the social safety net and divert money to things like the Cold War and growing industrialization and growing and global industrialization. So first I want to thank the gods of AI for helping me create this Ronald Reagan holding a red herring, which I think is a pretty good metaphor for what happens next. So Ronald Reagan sort of capitalized on this political moment by using racist dog whistles like a welfare queen in Chicago to plant the seed in American minds that unmarried black mothers are exploiting an overly generous social safety net, and created fertile ground to implement really, really restrictive paternalistic rules in welfare eligibility criteria. For example, in AFDC, in 1981, a new rule set asset limits for eligibility at $1,000, and those limits exist to this day in many states. There was also new asset limits created for the disability program, which exists to this day in many states. So all of this sort of culminates, all of this conservative backlash culminates in 1996. Clinton signs welfare reform with this idea that there's a growing dependence on an overly generous social safety net. Welfare reform of 1996 created flexibility for states. It's now, you all know this, but created block grants for states to kind of use the money as they will. You may have heard some states are giving it to Brett Favre to not give speeches, right? But people who have done analyses on this interstate variability have said that we now have like state welfare policies that are as different from each other as European countries have from one another. It also, there's some work I've done in the past that looks at like the asset limits, for example, in these different states. Some state asset limits for eligibility are $1,000, some are $10,000, some have even been eliminated, and a lot of good research is finding that That doesn't increase welfare rolls when you create more generous eligibility criteria, but it does help people build savings, help people buy vehicles to get to work, yada, yada, yada. We also need to think about some work that many of you are probably have done in the past is about the cliff effect, which means when a person makes just a tiny bit above the eligibility criteria for a program, let's say, a 10-cent raise at work or something, they lose eligibility for not only like TANF, but SNAP and medical assistance and child care assistance, and they're worse off than they were before, and why would anybody make that choice between putting food in their children's mouths and taking a 10-cent raise at work, right? So it really creates this disincentive for people to become, I don't like the word financially independent because we live in an interdependent human society, but to create more financial, less financial precarity. So what I really want to point out too in this picture, so Clinton very strategically signed this legislation with 2 black mothers behind him trying to signal their support. But because we now have this huge interstate variability in policy, Sporting and Schramm did some great work finding that states that have higher rates of African Americans have stricter time limits, lower income limits, lower benefits, more punitive sanction policies. They're more likely to impose family caps, and they're more likely to deny aid for past convictions. So stricter rules in states with higher African American populations. Meanwhile, in the 1990s, we've got child welfare reform efforts that are incentivizing states to decrease the amount of time that parents have to complete treatment plans when a child is placed in foster care, incentivizing states to increase adoptions. And we know that when a child is placed in foster care and then a family loses their TANF benefits, they're less likely to ever reunify, because how are you going to complete a treatment plan if you don't have cash in your pocket to get to parenting classes or whatever, right? We also know that when states implement sanctions for TANF noncompliance, and this could be something as stupid as not completing the right form or not completing, turning in the form the 10th time the caseworker lost it or whatever, those are associated with increased child abuse and poor school performance. I can tell you with certainty that parenting is hard, but especially if you're under significant financial strain. So between 1985 and 2000, the American foster care population doubled. A couple of researchers looked at a variety of state and national demographic, economic factors that could have contributed to that foster care increase, and they concluded that the war on drugs and welfare reform were directly related to that increase in foster care. This really has brought me to think about how we have a 2-tiered welfare system in the United States. We have one focused on low-income people that have punitive, paternalistic eligibility criteria, and one focused on middle and upper-income households like the mortgage interest deduction that constitute much larger shares of the federal budget, but don't come with those same intrusive paternalistic eligibility rules. For example, I don't submit to a drug test when I deduct my mortgage from my taxes, right? And so this really brought me to the world of thinking about universal basic income, guaranteed income, because when you strip all of these paternalistic, intrusive, counterproductive eligibility rules, what you're really left with is unconditional cash assistance. This concept first came about hundreds of years ago, but really in the United States started gaining momentum in the 1960s, supporters ranging from Martin Luther King Jr. to President Nixon. During that time of the 1960s and 70s, there was several large negative income tax trials that happened across the country. We've got a lot of great data that came out of those. In the intermittent time, there's been a lot of pilots internationally, especially in Africa. And right now, I guess we can thank Andrew Yang, there's about 100 pilots that have launched across the country, either currently or recently. And I'm evaluating, like I said, 5 of those. Across all of the pilots, you really see pretty consistent results. You see decreased poverty and crime, improved physical and mental health, improved family relationships, Children of recipients have better school attendance and educational outcomes. People continue to work. This is a question that the politicians really care about. No, people don't quit their jobs when they get UBI. Sometimes they work more if they have the capital to launch small businesses or, buy a car to get to work. And we also see increased spending. There's also some theoretical outcomes that a lot of the philosophers in this space talk about. So it would give workers greater bargaining power, advances racial and gender equality, compensates women for the billions of hours of unpaid care work that we contribute to the economy every year, gives people the opportunity to seek meaningful employment rather than stay in dead-end jobs, and create space for innovation so that artists or inventors have the space and time to create new things. So I'm going to shift gears now to In Her Hands, which is a pilot which launched in the Old Fourth Ward of Atlanta. This is Martin Luther King Jr.'s home neighborhood. It's where he was born. That's where Ebenezer Baptist Church is. That's where he and Coretta Scott King are now buried. And the Old Fourth Ward Economic Security Task Force started with community listening sessions. What do you need to reach greater financial stability? And they said, we need cash. We just need cash. So that's what they did. They launched a guaranteed income pilot. The rationale that the program gives for this pilot when they're talking to funders, when they're talking to the community, is that Georgia has some of the highest rates of racialized poverty and inequality in the U.S., one of the least generous social safety nets. Black women in Georgia face more economic insecurity than nearly any other demographic and are twice as likely to be stuck in poverty as white women. Black women have the highest labor force participation rate, yet have the highest income disparities and lowest levels of wealth of any group. And then the program very strategically chose 3 communities across Georgia that have the highest rates of disparities and condensed Black communities experiencing poverty across the state. So Atlanta's Old Fourth Ward, a rural Southwest Georgia cluster of 3 counties, and then a historically Black suburb of Atlanta called College Park. The pilot launched in 2022, and the name of the pilot is In Her Hands. It comes from a Dr. King quote, "The dignity of the individual will flourish when the decisions concerning his life are in," and they added, "her own hands." That came from his last book, where he was really pushing the idea of a guaranteed income. So in partnership with the community, the program worked really closely with the community to design this program down to what amount of money would be most helpful in your life, what frequency of transfer, all of the questions of program design were closely done in partnership with community advisory councils. It provides 654 low-income Black women with an average monthly payment of $850 for 24 months, and we'll talk about what that average means here in a second. The project goals are, did I see a hand over there or just a, yeah? Good question. Nope. So the eligibility criteria were identifying as a woman, having a low income, and that's it. Those were the 2 eligibility criteria.
Some children and not children.
Yep. I'll get to that in a second. I've got a demographic slide. Yeah, absolutely. The project goals support Black women experiencing financial insecurity in Georgia. And the language they like to use is greater financial stability and overcoming wealth decelerators. I don't know if this is used a lot in sort of the FCAB world, but they're really focused on wealth development and the wealth decelerators that impede Black families specifically from growing their wealth. If anyone is interested in this, there's a ton of great books, The Color of Money, The Color of Law, Race for Profit, Whiteness of Wealth. Yeah.
Just to go back, so the rationale for including only Black women as opposed to Black women and Black men is that Black women were identified as the most economically precarious in the context of racialized injustice in Georgia?
Yes,
correct?
yeah, exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for asking that. So let me talk about the intervention design. Also in the community listening sessions, something really interesting came out when they asked people what amount of money would be meaningful in your life. Some people said $800 would be great, but I'd spend the first few months just getting caught up on bills, paying off debt, maybe saving up for a down payment on an apartment. So they wanted to test this. And so 15,000 people entered the lottery 650 were randomly selected and then randomized into 2 treatment interventions. Cohort 1 is receiving $850 a month for 24 months, and a second intervention arm is receiving $4,300 in month 1 and $700 a month for the remaining 23 months. So for a total transfer of the same size, but we are going to be looking at, unfortunately I don't have all the data because we're about 12 months into the pilot now, but whether or not those 2 treatment conditions create different outcomes. So because the intervention is community-based, of course, the evaluations should be community-based. So I am using a community-based participatory design. I meet with the existing community advisory councils. The program had done a lot of work already to create partnerships with community experts. So I'm tapping into those, meeting with them annually to collaboratively design research questions, and of course decenter white researchers and white institutions. Our collaboratively designed research questions include health, income, assets, family relationships, well-being, employment, future orientation, and then our data collection includes biannual surveys, biannual interviews with a randomized subset. I'm partnering with the Social Policy Institute at WashU on the survey, and then partnering with 3 doctoral students at Clark Atlanta University and HBCU in the area to do qualitative interviews. So to Tim, your question about demographics. So overall, at baseline, the participants are late 30s, not living with a partner, 97% Black. So this is a really interesting side story for anybody interested in programs like this. So the program chose heavily Black neighborhoods, but didn't make that an eligibility criteria, partially just because of the complexity of like who's going to check on that, right? But it really turned out, but obviously they did a good job of when they're targeting. And thank goodness they did it this way, because after the Supreme Court struck down affirmative action, all like federal agencies, nonprofits who are specifically targeting race-based criteria are now open to being sued and are actively being sued. About 75% have at least one child in the home. So we've got about 25%, and a lot of those may be older women who are retired, but of course we also have like grandmothers raising children too. Again, stop me at any point if you have questions. We asked at baseline about government benefit receipt, just because we want to see if these things change over time. So about 2/3 are receiving SNAP. About a quarter are receiving some sort of public housing voucher. I'll stop on this point because it's interesting. In the Old Fourth Ward, this is a neighborhood that's really close to downtown Atlanta, has historically been a Black community, but it's suddenly become really trendy, and there's like $1 million lofts going up. So the only older long-term residents of low incomes who can really afford to stay there have to have some sort of like housing voucher or subsidized housing. So that's why almost half in the Old Fourth Ward have some sort of housing voucher. We asked about TANF receipt, which I shouldn't be shocked, but I am. That only about 1% were receiving some sort of TANF supplement, which, you know, hypothetically is the primary cash assistance program that should be serving people experiencing poverty. 15% receiving WIC, about 10% receiving SSI, 7% receiving SSDI. I want to say something about SSI because this is a really important point for anyone interested in guaranteed income pilots. So every pilot should be doing something called benefits counseling at the beginning of a pilot, where so In Her Hands did a really great job. They partnered with the Federal Reserve of Atlanta to create like a benefits calculator, so that when people are notified that they won the lottery, they come in, they meet with a benefits counselor who says, okay, what benefits are you receiving now? Here's how receiving this money is going to affect all those benefits. What's super interesting about that is that 99% of the people in that process said, even if it's like a dollar for dollar reduction in, you know, my housing assistance or whatever, I'll take it because I don't have to meet with my caseworker every month. I don't have to turn in the same form 10 times. The only exception to that rule is people who are receiving disability. Anybody who works in the disability world, it can take years to get back on the program. If you get kicked off, you have to hire an attorney. It's a really big headache. So for them, it just wasn't worth it, which is totally understandable. Yeah.
You didn't have any arrangement with state or local?
That's such a great question. Yeah, so the whole pilot space is talking about how do we get waivers so that this is not affecting benefits without a lot of luck. So this program particularly tried to work really hard with their local, TANF offices and everything. The only luck they had was with the local housing authority, getting some waivers for housing assistance. But, because of our old friend devolution, this isn't like a fight we could just win nationally and be done with it. It has to be really negotiated with every state and county government that these things are happening in. Yeah.
And this is where you went from 654 to 450?
Oh, that's response rates. So the whole pilot is 650, and this is response rates to surveys. Thanks for asking.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
So for eligibility, they have to be low income, or would they just have to reside in a low income?
Great question. They had to be low income. So, it was somewhat, I think it was like 150% of the poverty line or something. I can get the exact things if you're interested in. Good question. Yeah.
I'm curious how did they land on using 650 at this 850 a month? Because I mean,
Yeah.
you could have more people, less money.
Yeah. I think what they did is, what's a meaningful amount of money based on community feedback? How much money do we have divided by, $800 basically? Yeah. Yeah, meaningful, right. Yeah. Great question. Yeah. Jeff.
So I'm less surprised by the low payment rate
Yeah.
than I am by the low SNAP rate. Is it possible for you, using the responses from the survey, to impute or approximate eligibility?
Interesting.
And get
Yeah.
a sense both, and this SNAP question is before they go meet?
Yes. Let me think about that for a second. They did benefits counseling. No, so they did benefits counseling. We did a hard push for baseline surveys before the first payment landed. That was sort of the progression. So this would have been after benefits counseling, but before their first payment landed. So hypothetically, they're in that short time period, their participation might not have changed, but I can see a theory that maybe a few had already anticipated this new income. Yeah, Catherine.
I would just add they're probably not all head of household.
Mm-hmm.
So if they're in multi-generational families, they themselves may be low income, but they
Yeah.
may have access to other income
Yeah.
for food.
Yeah, sure. Or SSI, somebody might be receiving SSI in the household, or yeah, great point. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Because my concern was that this may actually be sort of a composite treatment, which is the income plus maybe somebody to be less fed. A lot of programs and benefits and co-pays and
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah.
a concern?
Sure. I don't know. I think you'd have to think through whether or not that was enough of an effect to make a significant difference. I haven't gotten to this yet, but we are also tracking the lottery entrants who didn't win, so we'll be able to compare those differences. We don't have that data. We're collecting the 12-month data right now, so we don't have that data, but I think that'll help us sort of sort that out. If we really wanted to get into the weeds with it, there's some state-level administrative records that may be available to us. That's a whole other level of consents and stuff. Jessica, did I see your hand? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious how much the $800 a month is relative to rent, average rent in these places. How much is
Yeah.
that relative to the cost of living? Do you have a sense?
Yeah, good question. No, I'm not going to venture exactly what the average rent is in these places, but that's a good question. I think the cost of living is going to be very different in these three places. So I think a decent hypothesis is that $800 a month is very different if you're living in rural Southwest Georgia than if you're living in downtown Atlanta. So we'll need to do some a lot more site-based analysis, and then of course tons and tons of subgroup analyses like the treatment conditions, whether or not they have children in the home, age, all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
For this overall number that you now have, the survey response rate, particularly for a group that's financially precarious, do you have any insight at this current stage of data collection of why there's been dropout? Do you know if it's systematically related to to becoming more financially precarious, losing housing, something to that effect?
Response rates. I mean, we're at like a 60-ish% response rate, and my understanding is that that's not a bad survey response rate. It's longitudinal, so there may be some attrition over people changing their phone numbers and stuff, but they have to like respond to a quick survey every month from the program to get their payment, just to make sure that like it's not going to the wrong person or something. So we have a better tap into when people change their contact information than we might in a different longitudinal survey. And both waves so far we've had in the neighborhood of 60 to 70% response rate. So, but attrition is always a risk. Good question.
I just, with financial precarity, I'd be curious if you're able to identify on who is leaving. Like, what if there is any kind of like level of systematic attrition?
Good question.
Related to finances.
Yeah, good question. And we could go back and like, okay, who responded to baseline but not to the fourth wave, and were they systematically different at baseline? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure, of course. Yes.
They met with the benefits offerings because some people, especially those on SSI, might have dropped out. Just
Yeah, like a small handful. Yeah.
So they're not in this.
Exactly. Yeah, they wouldn't have not joined the treatment.
They just picked some new people on the water.
Exactly. Yeah, great question. Okay. I love a room full of data nerds. Okay, so we also did some qualitative interviews shortly after people joined the program. And some of the emergent themes is just the very complex public assistance barriers they experienced. For example, they don't look at the bills and stuff you have, they go by what you make, and they don't go by responsibilities. Sometimes people have to pay bills or food or gas. Somebody talking about SNAP, they think they can put a limit on how much you feed your children, how much your children eat. This person really captured the catch-22, the child care assistance program. How can we get a job and we have kids at home? Want to give us daycare first, and then we can find a job because we cannot find a job, start working, get check stubs and stuff, and if we have kids at home, basically. We also asked about their assets and debt at baseline. They had a mean savings of $0 across the board. We saw credit card debt. We saw high levels of educational debt. I think this is really in line with some national literature that predatory educational institutions and lending institutions tend to be especially predatory in heavily Black communities. We saw high levels of auto loans, medical debt, personal loans. So we will be tracking these over time. What's really interesting is we also recently received money from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and Washington Center for Equitable Growth to track the Equifax data for all the participants in this pilot and a couple of other pilots, because we want to know if the guaranteed income can close racial wealth and credit gaps. So in sort of learning more about that and building that out, we were trying to build a hypothesis for what do we expect to see on this debt. So I was reading one paper that talked about how when you increase the minimum wage in a state, you see higher levels of auto debt. And that's because people are like, my income is higher now. I can go out and buy, I can make a car payment. So I'm going to go out and get a car loan. And interestingly, I'm skipping ahead here, but we saw the same thing at 6 months. Every level area of debt went down except for auto loans. People are going out and buying a car so they can get to work, take their kids to school, all of that. We asked them about their goals over the next 2 years. We asked this both in a closed-ended and open-ended question. But in our closed-ended, most people wanted to catch up, get ahead on bills, build emergency savings, reduce debt, buy or improve their home, improve their credit score, start or grow a small business. So I'm going to skip forward to our 6-month findings. Right now we have, yes?
Sorry, so people didn't respond, upgrade my car, get a new car.
So let me I'll go back to the open-ended ones on that, because what we're trying to do is let people, besides these sort of like closed-ended goals questions, we wanted people to self-define their goals. So like, at baseline, we said, what are your top 3 goals? And I do remember car coming out of that, but I don't remember like what the frequency was. I can go back to that. And then, at each survey way, we're piping in. So last time you told us your goals are X. How's that coming along and stuff? So we can track individual goals, because one of the complexities of evaluating guaranteed income pilots is people's own life trajectories are so different. One person wants to go back to school, one person wants to build their business, but, that sort of thing. So hopefully by allowing people to self-define goals, we'll see more. But I do remember like buying a car come up, but I can't remember like the frequency. Great question. Scanning. Okay. So it's 6 months right now. We have 6-month data right at this moment. We are collecting 12-month data with the treatment and the control group. Hope to have that data later this year, early next year. One of our survey scales is the CFPB's financial well-being scale. We saw that increase. We saw an average savings increase a little bit. You're going to say, wait a minute, I thought the average savings was $0 at baseline. So this is the average, not the mean. This is also participants answering both survey waves, and it's also Windsorized, so it's a slightly different number there. We saw average debt decrease by about 4%, again, in every area except for auto loans. We are looking at employment and work-life balance. So full-time employment in just the first 6 months went from 30 to 35%, nearly 40% increase in educational enrollment. But we also want to know, because 3/4 of these women are mothers, does it, it's not just about, are we getting you out in the capitalist workforce? Is it allowing you to do the things you need to do to take care of your family? So 20% of people reported using the payments to spend more time with their family. So we're not seeing any decreases in employment. What I think we're seeing is like maybe instead of working 4 jobs, people are working three jobs so they can spend a little bit more time with their children. Similarly, at 6 months interviews, people talked about developing their small businesses. I have the same goal of starting a business. It's just now I can actually execute my plan because I have a car and a home. Progress towards their personal goals. I'm moving toward the goal, maybe about 80% now, keeping up with my bills and taking care of my needs and the needs of my grandchildren. A lot of people had responses that we put under the umbrella of financial capability. My credit score is going up. I want to get it all the way up and buy a house. I know that I get these at a certain time of the month. I'm not behind on anything, so I can put a portion to savings. I have more flexibility. One of our survey scales is the USDA food security scale. Every single item on the USDA food security scale reduced or improved significantly in the first 6 months. Similarly, we saw significant improvements in every area of financial material hardship, including difficulty affording bills, inability to see a doctor because they couldn't afford it, having their phone service disconnected, inability to pay the full amount of utilities, inability to pay the full amount of rent or mortgage. People talked a lot about improved mental and physical health. So one person said, I think having this money has helped me utilize a healthier kind of eating plan and being able to buy those foods that are high in protein stuff, have on a consistent basis where I'm not always eating fast food. So I think mentally eating healthy is doing something for me. This is not a qualitative thing, but a side note, in our biannual survey, we are also using the Kessler-10, which is a scale of psychological distress. The percent of respondents who scored as likely to have a moderate or severe mental disorder reduced by 3% and 4% respectively in just the first 6 months. Impacts on relationships. And this is something that in all the pilots I'm evaluating keeps coming up. Really interesting. People talking about how it's improving their relationships with people around them. Maybe parents saying, I'm less stressed out, so I'm a better parent to my kids, or I can do generous things for my friends and my family. People also talk about it giving them the ability to sort of distance from less healthy relationships. And then really interestingly, people talking about how it sort of like increases their relationships with their community. Like maybe that's something like more time to volunteer, but also like feeling more generous towards others. People say things like, I have this blessing and I want to spread it to other people. So that's not an easy to measure thing, but it's really interesting that people are talking about this, sort of like gives them this grander sense of community. So in this pilot, one woman said, for example, my family's in Haiti, my mom, getting that big extra help has been helping me help her every month to build her house. I've been able to have more fun with my kids. And a lot of people talked about improving their housing conditions. I'm able to afford more things. I've been able to do some remodeling of my house so I can have better living conditions. I relocated, but we stay in the same neighborhood. We just moved into a better building, a secure building. And then this is the last one I'll wrap up on and let you guys jump in. So one thing we asked is, what would happen if everyone in your community received a guaranteed income neighborhood? Sorry. So people were, 90% positive, but there was some mix in there, and I'll, full disclosure, give you all of it. I feel like it would definitely help the community a lot more if everybody could get the same thing. Then a lot of people would be able to help their lifestyle and stuff like that, get jobs, get better cars, get transportation, get better living. The environment wouldn't be so hostile, wouldn't be a lot of crime going on, and people had more time. And then it's sort of like the minority perspective. One person said, I would rate it to maybe 50-50. There might be 50 people in the income that would benefit from the money and taking care of themselves financially, setting their priorities right. Other 50, I see that some are not. They're misusing the money and they're not using it like they're supposed to. And so I would say it's about 50-50, but it would help some people. I've done survey research on like attitudes towards basic income. And I've seen this before, like people would just be lazy or abuse it or quit their jobs, right? So I think that that is still there. That sort of like, capitalist mindset is still exists, but I do see people like changing over time to like, what if we didn't have to kill ourselves just to be able to eat and feed our children and live in housing and stuff. So it's really interesting how people's like mindset about this changes by receiving it. I'll shut up there and let your brilliant minds think of new things I should be asking. Yeah.
Do you actually mind going back to that last slide?
Sure.
With that participant, and if you happen to remember it, I'm intrigued by this, they're not using it like they're supposed to, right? Like what dictates supposed to, because this is guaranteed, or this is treated as guaranteed basic income, so, right, supposed to is completely subjective.
Yeah.
Did they go on to elaborate, or were there other responses?
I don't think that they elaborated specifically what that meant. One piece of context is when I was meeting with the community advisory councils, one thing that was really interesting is that the community advisory councils were totally bought into this idea of UBI, like social safety net's not working, we need unconditional cash, but we're really concerned that some people, not everyone will use it right, like, maybe they'll spend it, I think people said like spending it on luxury goods or something like that, which, like everybody likes to wear shoes, right? Everybody needs clothes to wear, that sort of thing. But I think their concern was that like they would use it for these things that we've societally decided that poor people don't deserve, and there would be judgment. So in that community advisory council, they kind of started having these conversations about like, what if your qualitative interviewers were kind of like motivational interviewers that like help people work towards their goals. And then I had to kind of explain like, that's not what we do, and we also want to make sure that we're measuring cash, not, financial counselors. That's not the intervention. But I think there was, I don't know if that's what's going on here, but I think there was like a hyper awareness that of the very judgmental ways we think about what people in poverty deserve and how that information would be used to harm policies like that, like this.
Yeah.
I think I hear what you're saying. Like, is this like the grandma who's, yeah, I think you're on the right track. Yes. So, sorry.
I'm curious, so you mentioned at the beginning, someone talking about, needing childcare to go to work. You saw something to do with employment. But I'm curious if you have done any analyses looking at parents specifically and like whether those incidents happen among parents or a exception of any childcare, or whether they were the ones using it to spend more time with their kids, or like if you've done any of that yet.
Yeah, I'm going to write that down. That's the next phase is subgroup analysis, specifically what's happening with parents, specifically. Yeah. Okay, I think I saw a hand there.
Oh yeah, I was just going to ask, like, for eligibility determination, did you ask people to like prove their income and like how you navigated that?
Yeah. Great question. Yeah, I think the program did have to do some like income eligibility determination. I think that they tried to be as broad as they possibly could in how they did that. And all kinds of different income type forms, but they did, yeah, they had to do some sort of income verification, but trying to be as least intrusive as possible. Yeah. Yeah.
I saw the 40% increase educational.
Yeah.
That's huge.
Yeah.
I was just curious, do you know what fraction of those are new enrollments or
Great question. Yeah. Or like going back to school or something. Yeah. I don't, but that's a good question we should ask. Okay. Yes.
I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how the community advisory boards were constructed, and then if you have any reflections about the sort of practice you had with them.
Yeah, so if I had just like, okay, I'm going to go into this community and do CBPR by myself, not even living in the state, it would have been a disaster. So the program itself had already done a lot of work that I piggybacked on to make partnerships with like local community organizations, and then kind of like word of mouth within the community, partnering where possible with like the city council. And so a lot of work went in the front end to make relationships with local community organizations, have those people help identify local community experts and stuff. So I think that's like the only way that CBPR, from my positionality, living out of state, could have done that authentically.
I'm sorry if you mentioned this already, I didn't catch it, but did you do any additional look at the benefit interaction? And any of, especially, I know the SSI and the SSDI were fairly low percentage, but even just people in other programs, because there were some higher participancy rates. Did you, like, any surveys or any kind of follow-up on how those were, the interactions in those programs?
By interactions, do you mean like how did it affect their eligibility, or
if they ended up, falling off some of those programs, or
we are asking at every data wave what programs they're receiving, so we will be able to see if like lower percentage of people report receiving those. Somebody recently asked me, like, are you asking exactly how many dollars they're receiving in those programs, which would be a really interesting research question. What if, like, hypothetically, what if they're actually getting less money now from those programs, but like the flexibility of the cash is worth it or something. We always have to balance, though, like intrusiveness with our research questions. So we have not asked people exactly how much money they're spending because we don't want to come across like a welfare office. Yeah.
How do you think about a short-term intervention to a structural problem? So, like,
Oh, the question that keeps me awake at night. Great.
24 months.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's not changing the system.
Yeah.
Like, I'm curious
Yeah.
too, like, how much the advisory community engaged in the discussion of how long the
Yeah.
intervention
Yeah.
should be and
Yeah.
what they're thinking that
Yeah.
done.
Yeah. The question that keeps me awake at night is, are we measuring a temporary intervention to make a case for a permanent policy change? And will human behavior be different in those scenarios? I had somewhat of a conversation with Irv Garfinkel at Columbia about this a while back, and he did a lot of work on like the New Jersey experiment in the 1960s, 70s. And there was some employment effects there. Later it was found that like, if you analyze it this way, it's not quite the same extent. Anyway, but his hypothesis was that for 2 years or whatever the length of the intervention is, your leisure is on sale. You've got this like 2 years, like, okay. And I see people saying this stuff like, I'm going to take a vacation for the first time in 10 years, just something like that. Like your ability to like slow down a little bit is on sale for 2 years of your life. So that's a different behavioral outcome than would be if it was a permanent income. So yes, I do worry about like the differing behavioral interventions. The different behavioral impacts of those two things. I think that just from a public policy perspective, I think the questions public policy questions people want to know is like, do they quit their jobs, and do they all go out and commit crimes or something, right? So like, I think we're probably going to be able to capture some of the most important public policy questions in a short time frame, but there are a lot of trade-offs. And then to the second half of your question is like, why 2 years? I think that was mostly a funding dependent question, but if you look at all the pilots across the country, a lot of them are like 12 and 24 months. I especially worry, and I'm evaluating one that's 12 months with people experiencing homelessness. That's a short amount of time to like get all of your financial ducks in a row and whatever barriers you need to overcome. So I worry about the outcomes of those pilots and what they're going to do to the evidence base in general. So this particular pilot just got a big ton of money, and they're actively seeking for a second cohort. And I have strongly encouraged and I think convinced them to do at least 3 years, because 3 years is really not very well represented in the pilot space. Jeff and then Tim, I think. Okay.
So a long time ago, in not in a galaxy far away, but partly in this building, when people were doing the big interconnect experiments,
Yeah.
At least one of the experiments was designed precisely to get at this issue of the intertemporal reallocation of ledger.
Yeah.
Contract
Yeah.
we're talking about. And so it had 3-year arms and 5-year arms.
Interesting.
I don't remember what it found, but if it, discussing those findings would be one way
Yeah.
to respond
Yeah.
to questions like
Great
that.
question.
And
Yeah, great point. I mean,
to add a question at the end.
okay.
Has anybody in the sort of modern round of EI evaluation deliberately varied the length of the intervention to try to get a modern
Yeah.
reading on the importance of this?
I haven't seen anyone doing that specifically for a research design question. I think basically it's the Wild West, people. Like Andrew Yang's campaign happened in 2020, and everybody's like, let's spend some money on a guaranteed income pilot. And then the researchers are like, how do we do this rigorously, right? So I haven't seen anybody like experimenting with time intervention, but that's a really good question. But what my hope would be, I think it's all just basically funding, like how many months and how many people can we fund is the practical answer. But I'm hoping that we'll have enough data from across these pilots that we can then sort of start asking like what was the differences in time, in amount, and all of the differences, and hopefully get some best practices for implementation outcomes. Tim, did you have? I think you were next.
Yeah, I'm worried about what it costs.
Okay.
I mean, there's donors and projects.
Yeah.
Catherine, BFY.
Yeah.
Pretty much people are finding that this is helping people. They're doing the right thing. They're investing in education.
Yeah.
Doing things for their kids. But even reformulate a little bit tighter national child allowance, like the one which Kearney is trying to push. That costs about $88 billion a year.
Yeah.
Just for children.
Yeah.
And without including individuals. And so my problem with all this is, well, who's willing to pay that?
Yeah.
One substantial group in this country doesn't believe in taxation at all, want to shrink it. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, the problem with our federal deficit is no one's willing to pay tax anymore. That's all come out of spending. Our state is very similar, it's given all the revenues back in tax refunds. So I keep getting hung up on how to pay for it in a permanent sense. I think it would be better if it was permanent.
Yeah.
I like to target 89 kids. I'd like to do away with most of them, or almost all the, the work tests and so forth, which is probably have to give some of that up, but people do work.
Yeah.
But 88 to 128 billion. You can go to the committee for responsible CFRB committee for federal responsible budget, and they have a simulation. You can pick your own parameters and tell you how much it costs you.
Yeah.
So you can just go out and pick this phase out rate, this subsidy rate, and get numbers that go up to about 170 billion.
Yeah.
That's a lot of money.
It is.
So I'm just, do I think it's worth it? Probably, but does a median person think it's worth it?
Yeah.
I don't know. So, I mean, we have an experiment here in the city. One of them.
Yeah,
they're
Madison
all over the
Forward,
place. Just from Mississippi, who came a couple of years ago talking about it. It seems to be helping people, and they seem to be responsible for money, but the importance is, in my mind, is permanency,
Mm-hmm.
and then, or at least, 5 years nationally or something, be renewable, but, how to pay for it. That's, I mean,
Yeah.
charity is great, Yang and everybody else, there's people who are willing to subsidize pilots, but to what end?
Yeah.
That's my problem. My end is permanent national,
Yeah.
and it costs a lot.
Yeah, I'm not an economist, but I know a lot of economists are working on this. I know a lot of economists are working on this. And a lot of people say that a huge amount of that cost could be created by simple tax reform, which, is there the political will for tax reform and deleting all the loopholes? Probably not. But that's one avenue.
There's going to be a chance. There has to be a tax bill.
Yeah.
One of the big tax cuts that has to be a tax bill this fall and next spring.
Yeah.
The tax cuts
Yeah.
that Trump put in through the TGA
Exactly.
logo.
Yeah.
That means the rates will go up for high-income people and so forth. And the bargaining chip on the Democratic side is some sort of, you have to be determined, child allowance.
Yeah. So I've talked to some lobbyists who are in DC who are working on this. They've expressed confidence, maybe a little bit too much confidence, that this Trump tax expiring creates an opportunity. But is there the political will for it? Okay. Okay. I see a hand back here.
Was your pilot publicly funded, and if so,
Great.
facing backlash?
Great question. So all of these pilots are sort of like a mix of funding. In her hands specifically is privately funded, so private donors, foundations, but a lot of the pilots across the country, maybe even Madison Ford, although I'm not sure about that, come from American Rescue Plan funds. So a lot of city and state governments got a buttload of money from the federal government and, to help you recover from COVID. And I think that's a lot where this big Wild West thing is happening, is people are like, cities are saying, what do we do with this money? Let's do a guaranteed income pilot, right? So I'm getting ready to work on one with the city of St. Louis, that they got this big tub of money from the ARP funds, and the best way to get it out the door is just direct cash assistance. So the public and private funding streams do come with a lot of different hoops to jump through. But as we're learning with the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action, even the privately funded ones can be targeted if they have a focus on racial justice. Okay, good.
So, talk about individual behavior change.
Yeah.
What about like the systems that they interact with? So, this is a small number of people who are getting it, but if you had a larger number of people, like our landlord's going to start charging more, our people are savvy on how to cheat people.
Yeah.
So, like,
Yeah.
what do we? Is anybody looking at that? And like, what would happen to the?
Yeah. I think that's called rent seeking, right? I don't think any of these pilots have enough saturation to create that behavior, but if they were, I think that would be an important component, is just to do landlords absorb it. I think there's somebody over here. Sorry, Catherine, and then, okay. Who's Heather?
So I have another concern with guaranteed pilots is people are concerned that we're just going to use it on drugs. And I didn't, maybe you kind of discussed it, do you kind of try and get at drugs or alcohol?
We don't, because we strategically made the question that we are not going to be that intrusive. I know it's a concern, but there's lots of other research looking at, like, did those things increase with the expansion of the child tax credit, and it's just not. So that's the research we point to for that question, but I very intentionally don't get that intrusive in people's lives. I think Catherine had a hand up, and then, okay.
I was quickly going to say, I think Luke Schaefer's doing one in Flint, where the entire city will be eligible the income limit is, but that'll get more to saturation.
Great. Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say, and I'm saying this a little bit because of my own consternation, which is, have we run out of the value of additional pilots? So one of the things that worries me a bunch is moving from the like trends, which just tell you what's happening with people in the program, to the contrast with the comparison group, and knowing how limited sample sizes really limit what you'll be able to conclude. Particularly when you would expect small effects on things. So, you know, is what we really need much larger studies, larger than mine, because we won't have the sample size at the end of the day either. That will be able to give much more precise answers. Because once you start, once you start building in the statistical uncertainty, and you've got 450 folks, there's not a lot that you can say with certainty. So, part of me, as part of this community with all of these pilots, thinks that we're not going to be in a good place when they're all done, because there's going to be a lot of we can't say much with certainty. I think at the local level, or the people who are initiating it from the provider side, it's wonderful. Right? But maybe it should happen without the research, because I don't know that the research is going to be as
a value add.
As people think it will be.
I think you're right, and I don't disagree with any of that. I know the folks at Penn, they're evaluating like 30 pilots and trying to create sort of like a master database, which will help a little bit, but to your point, that's still only, you're not going to see like the community level effects and stuff if you just have 500 people there and there and there. I friends in the space that whenever they talk to funders who are really interested in guaranteed income, they say, please don't fund another pilot, fund legislation. Because, we are sort of at a saturation of pilots at this point.
I have a question, but I totally agree with Catherine that strategically, like, how much more value can we get? How much more can we learn? Maybe there are some knowledge gaps around the policy that needs to be studied more. But thinking about how to build them overall, we already know enough to make a case for it. But I guess my question is, I'm really thinking about political will is so closely tied to our cultural beliefs around deservedness. You're mentioning like measuring or hearing people's beliefs about others' deservedness, and I'm really curious about how to measure our own feelings for ourselves of what we deserve, and if by participating or by receiving cash, basic income, or income, if that changes recipients' own personal beliefs of what they deserve and what they can be asking or demanding from larger systems. So I don't know how to measure that, or if you know.
Not in a systematic, large-scale way, but I see this theme coming through just in the people I'm talking to qualitatively. It's so interesting. Like, I've seen people start in the pilot, like, I'm afraid to touch this money. I don't, or they'll say things like, when I ask people, like, do you ever feel pressure about how you should spend this money? Their response was, well, no, but I know I'm spending it in the right way. So the answer to that question is then yes, right? So that they do feel that pressure, but they sort of they tell themselves, but I'm okay because I'm spending it in the right way. But I do see sort of this, in one pilot that I'm working on that's 5 years, it's a smaller pilot, but I see an evolution in people from that sort of fear of judgment to I turned 60, I deserved a good birthday, and I went on a little trip, right? And I see that evolution in individual human beings, but it'd be interesting to capture it. I do want to come back to your point and Catherine's point about how many more pilots do we need. If nothing else, I hope this results in some sort of federal legislation, but if nothing else, I think it is creating an interesting or much better model for philanthropy. If there's a rich person who wants to spend $10 million in the community, just give it to people, don't make people jump through all these hoops. So I think if anything, hopefully, I try to be optimistic, but if anything, hopefully we're creating a better model for philanthropists. I see a hand back there.
Thinking about the UBI pilots and what we're looking at when we test what people's reactions are or responses are in terms of what they do with it, because you think about UBI and similar parallel programs that are well established like Social Security or the unemployment insurance program, people adjust their behavior because they're there and they're not going.
Okay.
But these temporary programs are tied to a certain kind of precarity.
Mhm.
They're gone in a flash, but, when, parents make decisions about their children based on there being Social Security and the expectation that it's going to be there. So I'm wondering how, the temporal generalizability of this and some of the projects.
Yeah. Yeah. Of like where people are in their life phase.
Yeah, just in terms of getting a decent chunk of
Yeah.
money for a short period of time, get approved once at a time.
Yeah.
Being in a milieu where this is the norm, is another setback.
Yeah.
I don't expect you to have an answer. I'm thinking about it.
So I think that only, I'm gonna jump into the quick
Yeah.
part. I think if you talk to low-income people, they don't necessarily see other programs as being reliable. Right, so through administrative mistakes or through like, right, sanctions and stuff that, and I'm not speaking so much about like social security disability, or maybe even UI, but possibly UI, but like the TANF, the SNAP, all of those things, like they experience as much less regular and reliable than we may, outside of those communities to think of them because they're, so that's what I think they would say, is that what we see as reliable, they do not experience as being like a given. Anyway, so length is different.
Okay, one hand here and then there.
So to move back down from the conversation, I know you don't have comprehensive subgroup results now, but have you sort of any initial observations about the effect of your two cohort split, the lump sum payment?
I wish I had. That's like a pending analysis we're doing right now. So I haven't. I would be interested to see if like the lump sum people were like more likely to go out and put a down payment in a car or something like that. But I haven't. I know we all want the data now.
But to my point, it has to be really big differences for those subgroups to show up as different
Yeah.
from each other.
Yeah, yeah,
So that's what worries me. It's like, at the end of the day, how much are we really moving out?
Yeah. Okay, there and then Jeff.
Yeah, my question was also about actually the timing thing, the lump sum.
Yeah.
Was there ever any discussion of like, one thing you could do is just pick the whole lump sum at once? And with the way that you did it, was there any discussion, like, was it about the benefit cliffs things, or kind of like, what's the argument against just giving it all to them?
Yeah.
Medicaid.
That's
Like that's the one benefit that no one can get around. And if you start giving lump sums in that way, anyway.
But this lump sum was small enough that wasn't an issue.
Yeah, I guess it must have been if people chose it. Yeah, great point. I think that also like there's the movement to move like the child tax credit to a monthly payment to an annual lump sum is that that the annual lump sum creates a lot more income volatility for people who are in financial precarity. And there's research that they, and I realize this isn't exactly a one-to-one comparison because we're just talking about a one-time transfer, but like when people know that they've got an EITC payment coming, they'll delay medical appointments or something until that money comes in. So, and we know that people who have low incomes experience high levels of income volatility. So at least the theory behind this is to smooth that income volatility, which kind of smooths a lot of just moving from emergency to emergency thing and not knowing, how much money your next check is going to be type of thing.
Yeah, and it's just interesting to me because it seems like in some way that is being paternalistic.
Yeah, sure. Sure. Yeah.
But I mean, the benefits thing totally makes sense. But does that ever come up?
The way, not in this particular pilot, but I have seen a lot of really important discussions happening around reparations. Like, do we just need to cut a check for reparations for that, or should that be done through guaranteed income or baby bonds or something like that? That's where I've seen that lump sum conversation happening more often, but thanks for that point. Yes?
But with guaranteed pilot programs, I'm on the Madison Forward Fund.
Oh, great.
So I don't see too many other programs you're assisting, they're intentionally designed with you needing alongside each other.
Yeah.
What is your sense of like how much effect that portion is, impacting?
That's a good question. Yeah, I'm not in on the nitty-gritty of every single pilot, but I do think it's certainly a minority of pilots that have that close community partnership. Yeah, now I'm realizing we should, when we do the 10 years from now, when we're doing the meta-analyses, that should be a variable. Was it community-driven, community-designed? Yeah.
We're going to riff a little bit on Melissa's question. So in the qualitative work, before you set this up, I'm just curious to know what people said about the lump sum versus the monthly payments. Because there's a discussion around the ITC, and for a while the ITC had an option where you could smooth out the payments, and that option ultimately got rid of. You had extremely low pickup. Now you could tell stories about people who didn't trust that or whatever.
Yeah.
But there did seem to be a demand among the ITC recipients for this sort of four-stage program. So I can imagine this might be very heterogeneous.
Yeah.
It would be interesting
Yeah.
to have a third arm. Where you gave,
just one lump sum.
where you gave people the option.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
And to see what they would think and how that would affect what they did.
Yeah.
So the trick of it becomes like the minute that is considered income.
Yeah.
Taxable, like, right, so then it's, which it is probably taxable.
Yeah.
You get into this mess of things that you can't get out of without changing everything else.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.